Well, I am Farwell Brown. Today I'd like to talk about some of the incidents, or a few incidents related to the scene of my early years in Ames, and maybe some others. I have done this under the heading of Footnotes to Ames History a few times. Some of these things, they're not related to each other, but I thought they might be of interest. To begin with, I'd like to tell about Dwight Eisenhower's first visit to Ames. We all know that he announced his candidacy, or gave one of his first speeches during the 1952 campaign for the presidency when he became president, right here in Ames over WI. As a second lieutenant, correction, I think he was a lieutenant colonel in 1919 when the United States Army announced that they were going to conduct a coast-to-coast military convoy, the purpose of which was to determine the maneuverability of the military equipment. You see, World War I had ended just a short time before, and the matter of preparedness was in the minds of the military leaders, and so they planned this convoy. It was decided to conduct this convoy over Lincoln Highway. Now, Lincoln Highway had become a coast-to-coast highway system in 1913 or 14, and as you know, it went right through Ames. So when it was announced that it was going to follow the Lincoln Highway route from coast to coast, people of Ames immediately were interested because they would have a chance to see it pass through our city. Well, the part that I really want to tell about is when they did go through Ames. They left Washington, D.C. on the 7th of July in 1919. There were 287 men and 72 trucks and pieces of military equipment on wheels, of course. And they left Washington, D.C. on that date. Now, you would realize that there was very little paving across our country in 1919. And it wasn't until about the 25th, I think it was the 25th of July, that they would be approaching Ames. They stayed overnight on the 24th, night of the 24th, in Marshalltown. Well, the people of Ames thought it would be very nice if they could have a special event right here in town, and tentative plans were talked of to have the convoy come into town and come north on Duff Avenue up to Main Street, come down Main Street, and maybe stop at the corner of Kellogg and Main Street and have a few speeches by prominent people such as the mayor and General Lincoln, who was the director of the military training at Iowa State and had seen service in several of the wars of our country. And so these plans were talked about. And the day before they were to arrive in Ames, a representative of the Tribune telephoned to, or the night before I should say, to Marshalltown and made arrangements for the convoy to do as we had planned. I should say they thought they had made plans, because here's what happened. When the next morning, Lyle Minard, who was representing what then was the Chamber of Commerce, and a representative of the Tribune were waiting on the corner of Duff Avenue and Lincoln Way, what is now Lincoln Way in Ames. And when the motorcycle convoy came into sight, they stopped them and told them, now here's the corner that you go north. And they were immediately told, well, we're sorry, but we don't have any such orders, and our orders are to proceed right on through on Lincoln Way here and go to Boone before we stop. Well, they made a hurried drive to Nevada. It was futile. They could not locate the commanding officer. So what happened is that It was not until the commanding officer's car came along and they spotted it as it entered Ames. And that was, his car was the only one that came up to Main Street and went down Main Street, and of course he was in a hurry. The main convoy of the 287 men and 72 trucks proceeded without delay right on through Ames. Well, now there were a lot of people up on Main Street planning to see this convoy, and when they heard what had happened, they made a run to get down to Lincoln Way, and they did get to see the convoy go through town. But what the convoy did was proceed on to Boone, and they stopped out there at the corner, it's known as the Moore Corner, where there is still a big concrete corner with the name Lincoln Highway on it. And that's where they had their noon meal that day, and then they proceeded by arrangements. And I forgot to say that the Boone people had done a little better than Ames. They had talked to the commanding officer. They had talked to the right person. And their arrangements and agreements were carried out, and the convoy proceeded after they had their noon meal down to the corner of 6th and Story Street, right in the heart of the downtown district, and they had speeches. And I've often said that's when Boone put one over on Ames, although they didn't intend to. Well, that convoy took 60 days to reach San Francisco. And during that trip, they had to rebuild 65 bridges. One of their trucks, one of the Army trucks, actually slid off the highway as it went down the hill west of Boone. They had to test the bridges to see if they would carry the heavy equipment. And you can imagine what it was like in those days. And some of the men were saying that they either were eating dust or plowing mud as they proceeded westward. Well, the significance of that to Ames was that when Eisenhower became president, he was a great supporter and prime mover in the interstate highway system. And of course the highway department was right here in Ames, and you know what that meant to the state of Iowa. And of course Ames is on I-35 and close to I-80 today. And that way back in 1919, and I think probably Boone did have an edge because just 4 years earlier, Dwight Eisenhower had married Mamie Dowd, who was related to the she had an uncle, an aunt in Boone, and I think that probably had some bearing on Boone getting the larger share of their time on that when they went through Iowa. Well, I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about some of the recreational areas that we had when I was a boy. Some people have heard of Lake Comar, for example, Dayton Park, another one located not far out of Ames. We had no swimming pools in Ames. There was just one golf course, and that was the country club when I was a boy. And so that places like Lake Comar and Dayton Park that I'd like to talk about, visit with you about for just a moment. Now, Lake Comar was one that went back before 1900. A man by the name of Watkins had discovered artesian wells on his farm. It was located about 2 miles south of Story City, puts it about 8 miles north of Ames and a mile east of what is now Highway 69. The route that we used to go was up to the Gilbert Corner and then go to the first corner east and then north about 2.5 miles. And Lake Comar was then on the west side of the road. Lake Comar consisted of a lake that was large enough for boating. And when I was a boy, they had a nice swimming facility that they had developed in the 1920s up there. As I indicated, it was fed by artesian wells. My father used to go out there when he was a boy, when it was known as Watkins Well. In 1914, a man by the name of Fred Corneliuson and a man by the name of Marvick purchased the property from the Watkins people, farmers, and they're the ones that really developed the area as an amusement park. and they're the ones that enlarged the lake and built the swimming facility. When I was a boy, many Ames boys went up there, and many families went up there for picnics and went up there to swim. They developed that into a number of facilities. They had a golf course. It was sand greens, they called them. Many people from Ames played up there in the late 20s and 30s. But the swimming facility was outstanding. The water was great. It was they didn't have to treat it. They didn't treat it. It was you were swimming in artesian water, good cool water in the summertime. And they had a bathhouse and a diving tower, and to attract large crowds on special occasions such as the 4th of July. Mr. Corneliuson was great on bringing talent in from a distance to provide extra entertainment. For example, it was in the 1920s that he brought Johnny Weissmuller, who, if I pronounce his name correctly, was on the Olympic swimming team, and many folks today will remember him as having been in the movies as Tarzan later. Johnny Weissmuller came to Ames, and at that time the swimming coach at Iowa State was C.E. Daubert, and they became acquainted, and he would stay with the Dauberts, and he would spend a day with the swimming team at Iowa State. He did that on one or two occasions, put on demonstrations for them. But he was an attraction out there. You may remember the Major Bowes program that used to be on the radio, the Amateur Hour. Corneliuson brought Major Bowes out to Lake Comar, and he had built an outdoor stage. Incidentally, if you go up there by there today, that stage is still there, but the last time I saw it, it was full of baled hay. But he brought in singing groups from Des Moines and other places, and speakers, special speakers during the political years. 4th of July was a very, the attendance was very heavy up there. I've seen the parking lots up there full of Model T Fords. I suppose in my father's day they may have had buggies lined up out there. It was a very popular swimming place and picnic place, as I said. That ran, it was very popular until I would say about the mid-1930s, when it began to taper off. With better highways and better cars and swimming pools being built, as Ames, Dad Carr built his swimming pool in the middle 1920s, and other towns around in the county had swimming pools, and that, of course, cut into the popularity of places like Lake Comar. And during the 1930s, Mr. Corneliuson discovered that someone had put, I think a friend had put some goldfish in his lake, and he discovered that they were multiplying very rapidly. It gave him an idea. The result was that he switched from maintaining a park such as it had been to the production of goldfish. And he built up a tremendous goldfish operation there, and he was supplying goldfish to Woolworths and Kresge stores in Omaha and Kansas City and places like that for about, I suppose, a decade at least. Today, it's all back into farm operation. You will not even see the lake up there, but you will see the artesian flowing wells if you visit the area. I mentioned Dayton Park. 1915, a man by the name of A.L. Dayton, who owned 80 acres on what is now Dayton Road. In fact, I think that's where the name came from for Dayton Road today, that goes out past the disease lab. Dayton Park was located right at the corner of what is now Dayton Road and the road that goes east to the interstate. And off to the east of that corner is where Dayton Park used to be located. There's a ravine that runs down, excuse me, east-west there toward the Skunk River. And A.L. Dayton built a dam on that ravine and created quite a attractive lake. He developed a sand-bottom swimming area and bathhouse on the north side, and he had boats that you could rent. My first memories of Dayton Park would have been about 1915, when I was, of course, only about 4 or 5 years old. He had a confectionery building up on the top of the hill, and a number of Ames people built small cabins up there, and their families would stay out there during the summer months. Dayton Park, again, was a very popular place. He brought in entertainment, as had Mr. Corneliuson at Lake Comar. And again, by the late 30s, the swimming and the boating facility was no longer as popular as it had been. And like Lake Comar, 4th of July and other special occasions were big occasions out at Dayton Park. So Mr. Dayton switched his attention to maintaining a skating rink and a dancing area out there. He had it was a rather popular place for Ames people and people in the area to go dancing on Saturday nights. And today, again, that is reverted back to farmland and is actually the site of a number of homes today. Maybe 2 or 3 very nice homes are located on that property. The next thing that I would like to talk about is sort of goes back to the talk that we gave earlier, yes. Well, before I do that, let me tell about some of the scene that I recall on Ames. I mentioned on one occasion remembering a runaway. We had horses and buggies when I was a small boy, and Main Street would be lined with buggies, and we had hitching posts in front of the Methodist Church and the Congregational Church and other churches in town in those days. And once in a while, a team would run away and cause some excitement. And I remember the first one that I remember was when, after dark, a buggy got tangled up in a pile of brush up on the corner of 10th and Kellogg. And that's the first time I ever heard a man utter oaths at his horse, and it created quite a bit of excitement. My father had to go out and help the gentleman, and he had to come back next day to get his wagon. He was able to take the horse home that night, however. But one of the dramatic runaways that I remember knowing about, I didn't see it. It was in 1914, I believe. A man was bringing some farm produce into town in January in a what do you call it, a bobsled. And he was coming down Kellogg, and as he approached 5th Street coming south, he lost control of his team, and they started to run. He was able to turn them onto Main Street, thinking he could slow them down, but that didn't really happen. Instead of slowing down, they just maintained their speed, and the bobsled upset and slid into the curve right about where the Ames Stationers is now and upset. The crowd gathered around and tipped the bobsled over, expecting to find something less than a healthy man, and he jumped up and was hardly scratched. But his produce, eggs and things, were all over the sidewalk there. There was no paving then, of course, but there was a stone curbstone. They caught the horses down about where the Munn Lumberyard is today. Another runaway that was rather unusual was, this happened about a year later up on 8th Street. A woman was proceeding toward Duff Avenue in her horse with buggy, and the horse was frightened by an auto coming up on Duff. Remember, there was no paving in those days. And the horse and buggy proceeded to collide with the car. Well, the story in the Ames paper started off with the fact that the horse ended up in the back seat of the car. And I think the woman had some minor injuries, but no fatalities, of course. So you had things like that happening once in a while in Ames when I was a boy, and we didn't have automobile accidents, but we had horses that ran away. Let me move now to something that does go back more definitely to what we talked about before. Several years ago, when my wife and I were out in the western part of the country, we came back through Wyoming. I had heard of the Ames Monument. The Ames Monument was built in memory of Oakes Ames, for whom our city was named originally, and his brother Oliver. It was built in 1881 and 1882 near Sherman Hill, about 30 miles west of Cheyenne, Wyoming. That monument was right on the Union Pacific Railway line at the time. In 1900 or 1901, when they went to a two-track system, they relocated the railway line about 1.5 miles or 2 miles to the south, so it is no longer on the railway line. That monument won a national award for its architectural design, a monolithic design, and it is about 60 feet in height. It cost about $65,000 to build. The Union Pacific built it in memory of those two men who had been very influential in the completion of the UP system. That monument, as I say, is made out of stone that was obtained within 1 mile or 2 of that location out there on the prairie. Today it's all by itself about 1 mile off of I-80. Other Ames people have taken the occasion to go and see it. It is rather interesting. The plaque that is with that indicates that the great contribution that particularly Oakes Ames made to the success of that project in completing the Union Pacific. It seems that at one point the Union Pacific was almost out of funds, and the great expense in going over the mountains had been a great problem. And Oakes Ames and his brother Oliver had put about $1 million of their own funds into the project in order to complete it. There's one statement on the that I'd like to quote that's on the plaque there, and it says, "The contribution of Oakes Ames was especially significant, even though in 1873 he had been implicated in a scandal relative to the financing of the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad," which causes me to comment just a little bit on that. Oakes Ames had been drawn into what had become a scandal in 1873. The railroad, as you will recall, had been completed in 1869. His being drawn into that was rather fascinating, I think. He got into a disagreement with a Colonel McComb of Delaware, who had been a friend of his, as a matter of fact, and McComb alleged that Oakes Ames had promised to obtain for him stock in the Union Pacific at par. Well, Oakes Ames denied this, and then when McComb threatened to publish the letter in which Oakes Ames had said that he had been able to place stock with the members of Congress, so that he said in the best places, he said that he would release those to the newspapers. And Oakes Ames did not concede to that. He stood up to McComb. As a result, McComb did release those papers, and the newspaper in New York, I think it was the New York Sun, ran a very incriminating story in which they charged Oakes Ames with trying to bribe members of Congress. Well, that of course resulted in various hearings, and Oakes Ames was not put out of Congress, but he was reprimanded. Censored is the word. And his death occurred very soon after that happened in 1873. And various things have happened since that time. And I think today what I'd like to do, it's not necessary for us to make a final decision on it, but I think that the statement that I have that Stuart Holbrook wrote in the 1950s, he said, Oakes Ames was made the goat in chief for the whole rotten business, and it is only fair to point out that more recent and cooler historical opinion has cleared him of the charge of being consciously corrupt. And that is really what I personally believe about the whole thing. But that monument, if you ever have a chance to see it, do that. And it's really quite a impressive construction out there in Wyoming. Well, those are some of the things that I thought I would talk about this morning, and thank you very much for listening.